Chapter 3. The Visitors. It was the morning in which the whole party, including the Miss Dashwoods and Colonel Brandon, breakfasted at the park, and there received their morning post. There was a letter for Colonel Brandon. He opened it, read a few lines, got up and said quickly, "I'm very sorry to have to leave such a lovely party, but a very important business calls me to London. I cannot lose 1 hour." And with this he left in a terrible hurry. Everybody wondered what the business could be, and Mrs. Jennings especially, as she took the greatest interest in her friend's affairs. The next day, Willoughby was invited to dine at the cottage. In the afternoon, Mrs. Dashwood, with Eleanor and Margaret, went to visit Lady Middleton, and Marianne decided to stay at home and get the dinner ready. When the ladies returned from their walk, they found Willoughby's carriage outside the house. As they went in, they saw Marianne crying and running upstairs, while Willoughby was standing by the fire looking very sad. "Willoughby, what is the matter?" asked Mrs. Dashwood. "I am unable to stay with you for dinner tonight," Willoughby answered slowly. "Mrs. Smith sends me on a very important business to London." "Oh!" exclaimed the ladies. "But," said Mrs. Dashwood cheerfully, "it cannot take you very long. When will you be back?" "I do not expect to be back within 12 months, said Willoughby. "Oh, it is useless," he added passionately. "I cannot stay any longer here, among such friends whose company I am not allowed to enjoy." With this, he left. Marianne would have thought herself cold-hearted had she been able to sleep a minute that night, or the whole of the following next week. She ate nothing, did nothing, felt weak and cried most of the time, giving pain to all her family, who could not help her in any way. One day, Eleanor managed to persuade her, at last, to go for a walk. As they were starting to enjoy themselves, Marianne noticed a figure of a gentleman on horseback in the distance. "It is he! It is he!" she cried, and ran towards the figure. But it was not Willoughby. It was Edward Ferrars, and, fortunately for him, as he was at that moment the only person in the world who could have been excused for not being Willoughby. For in Marianne's eyes he was the equivalent of Willoughby for her elder sister. Edward was warmly welcomed at the cottage by Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters. He was asked to stay as long as he wished. He stayed for a week, during which time he was so involved in the whole carousel of dances and excursions organised by Sir John that he had not much time to enjoy the peace of the cottage and the company of his hosts. One day, however, they had a free afternoon and were drinking tea in the sitting-room. While pouring her tea, Edward's hand passed so close before Marianne's eyes that she noticed a ring of hair on one of his fingers. "I have not seen you wearing this ring before, Edward," she exclaimed. "Is this your sister's hair? I thought her hair was darker." There was a silence for a moment, and at first Edward seemed too embarrassed to answer. "Yes," he said at last, "it is Fanny's hair. It looks different in different light, you know." Both Eleanor and Marianne were at this moment sure that it was in fact Eleanor's hair. The difference between them was that what Marianne thought was a gift from her sister, Eleanor knew must have been stolen from her in one way or another, as she had never given her hair to anybody. Soon after that incident, Edward announced that he must leave them, preferably that very day. He did not know where or on what business, but still go he must. And he did go, leaving them all to wonder at the speed of his departure. Eleanor especially did not know what to think. She felt very strongly that Edward was in love with her as much as she was with him, but she also saw that there were some great obstacles to their happiness. Whatever the situation, however, to her sister's greatest amazement, Eleanor neither cried nor starved herself on Edward's departure. Quite the opposite. She tried to cheer up the rest of her family. Sir John tried to cheer them up too, and the best way to do that was, in his opinion, to bring them new visitors. Therefore, as soon as Mrs. Jennings' distant cousin from Exeter the Miss Steeles arrived at the park to stay for some 2 or 3 weeks with Lady Middleton, he lost no time to introduce them to the Miss Dashwoods. During dinner at Barton Park, Eleanor and Marianne had the opportunity to get to know the 2 young ladies and make up their minds about them. Miss Anne Steele was about 30, with a plain face, and seemed to be able to talk of nothing but admirers. Her younger sister, Lucy, was about 23, was much prettier and much cleverer than Anne. They were both poor relations of the Middletons, but were so skilful at pleasing everybody that hardly anybody could see through their tricks, and all loved to include them in their party. The Miss Steeles made sure that they admired each of Lady Middleton's dresses, and laughed at all Mrs. Jennings' jokes, and loved beyond anything to play with the spoiled children of anybody of fortune. In short, the Miss Dashwoods saw nothing nice about them, and would have preferred not to be acquainted with them at all. That, however, was not possible. Sir John was determined to make them best friends, and not a day could be spent without them having to visit each other on some purpose. One day, when they were all walking, Lucy separated Eleanor from the rest and asked her in a whisper, "I'm sure you will think that my question's a strange one, but do you know Mrs. Ferrars?" Eleanor did think the question a very strange one, but said calmly that she had never seen Mrs. Ferrars in her life. "Well, if I dare tell you all," said Lucy with a coquettish smile, "I may be one day very intimately known to Mrs. Ferrars." "Good heavens!" exclaimed Eleanor. "Are you acquainted with Mr. Robert Ferrars, Mrs. Ferrars's younger son?" "Mr. Robert Ferrars?" exclaimed Lucy in return. "Oh, no!" Then she lowered her voice, and looking straight into Eleanor's eyes, she said, "I am engaged to Mr. Edward Ferrars, Mrs. Ferrars's eldest son and heir."